It was one of those quiet mornings that didn't ask for much. The kind folks used to call a good start. Margaret sat at the small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had already gone lukewarm. She didn't mind, these days she took things slow. Outside, the neighborhood was just waking up. A car rolled by. Somewhere close, a screen door slapped shut. Same old sounds. Same old street. Margaret glanced around the kitchen. Nothing fancy. Just a room that had seen a lot of living. Scratches on the table. A clock ticking louder than it probably should. The kind of ticking you notice only when everything else is quiet. Funny thing was, she liked it that way. She stood up and walked toward the old wooden desk in the corner. The one that had been there forever. Or close enough to forever to feel like it. She hadn't planned on opening it. Truth be told, she hadn't thought about it in years. But sometimes your hands move before your mind catches up. She pulled the drawer. It stuck. Yeah, she muttered, that figures. She pulled again. A little harder this time. The drawer slid open. Inside were things that didn't belong to today. Envelopes. Folded papers. A ribbon faded from years of sitting still. Margaret sat back down and lifted a small bundle tied with twine. Her fingers tightened just a bit. She already knew. Letters. Letters she had written a lifetime ago. Letters she never sent. Letters she told herself she'd deal with someday. Well, someday had come and gone. Margaret rested her hands on the bundle and let out a slow breath. Well, she whispered, look what turned up. The house stayed quiet. But it listened. Margaret didn't open the letters right away. She just sat there. Hands resting on the bundle like it might move on its own. Funny how paper could feel heavy. Not in weight, but in meaning. She leaned back in her chair and stared at the far wall. Letting her eyes soften. Letting the memories come if they wanted to. Back when she wrote these, life felt different. Slower somehow. People waited back then. For letters. For answers. For things to make sense. You didn't get everything right away. And nobody expected you to. Margaret smiled faintly at that thought. She remembered sitting at this very table. Pen in hand. Stopping every few sentences to think. Not because she didn't know what to say. But because she knew exactly what she meant. Words mattered more then. You didn't toss them around. You didn't waste them. And once you put them down on paper, they stayed put. She picked up the top envelope and turned it over slowly. The paper had softened with time. Edges worn smooth from being handled and put back again. She had written her own name in the corner. Like she needed reminding who the letter was for. Guess I wasn't too sure back then, she murmured. The room stayed still. The clock kept ticking. Steady and patient. Margaret thought about all the times she meant to send these letters. After one more thought. After one more day. After things felt clearer. Turns out, Clarity doesn't always show up when you expect it. Sometimes it never shows up at all. She stacked the letters neatly in front of her, lined up like they'd been waiting for instructions. "Well," she said quietly. "No point putting it off forever." She took a breath. Slow and careful. Outside, the morning carried on like it always did. Cars passing. Birds calling out to no one in particular. Inside, Margaret reached for the first envelope. Margaret held the envelope just above the table. Not opening it yet. Just feeling the paper between her fingers. There was a time when that paper had been crisp. When the ink was dark and fresh. When the words inside still felt risky. She could remember that version of herself. Sitting here. Heart beating a little faster than usual. Back then, she'd thought writing the words was the hard part. Turns out, sending them was harder. She turned the envelope over again. Slow and careful. Like she might disturb something sleeping inside. Funny thing about letters. Once you write them, they don't forget. People do. Time does. But letters just wait. Margaret glanced toward the window, watching the light shift across the floor. The morning had moved on without her. Like it always did. She smiled softly. "Story of my life," she whispered. She thought about who she'd been writing to. About the sound of that person's voice. The way they used to say her name. Some voices stick with you, even after everything else fades. Especially those. She placed the envelope back down and straightened the stack, lining the corners just right. Old habit. Her mother used to say a neat desk meant a clear mind. Margaret had never been sure about that. But she liked neat things anyway. They made the waiting easier. The clock ticked on. Steady and sure. Not giving her any advice. Margaret rested her palms flat on the table and took another breath. Slow. Measured. Whatever was in these letters. It had already lived inside her once. She wasn't afraid of it anymore. Maybe she never really had been. Maybe she just needed time. A whole lot of it. She reached for the envelope again. This time with purpose. "All right," she said softly. "Let's see what you've got." The paper made a faint sound as her fingers found the edge. Margaret slid a finger under the flap of the envelope. Slow enough to feel the paper give way. The sound was soft. Barely there. But it filled the room all the same. She pulled the letter out and unfolded it carefully. As if it might tear just from being remembered. The handwriting was hers. No doubt about that. Slanted slightly to the right. Steady and deliberate. She stared at the first line without reading it. Letting the moment settle. Funny how a few words could carry so much weight. She cleared her throat. Not because she needed to, but because it felt right. Margaret began to read silently. Her eyes moving slowly across the page. The words were simple. Nothing fancy. Just honest. She remembered choosing them. crossing some out, rewriting others, trying to get them just right. Back then, she had worried about saying too much. Now, she wondered if she had said enough. The clock kept ticking, steady as ever, like it didn't care one way or another. She paused halfway down the page, resting the letter on the table. Some sentences reached farther than others. They touched places she hadn't visited in years. She thought about the day she wrote this. The weather outside. The way the light had fallen across the floor. Funny what sticks with you. Margaret folded the letter once, then opened it again, not quite ready to put it away. "Well," she murmured softly, "you were braver than I remember." She felt something loosen in her chest. Just a little. Not relief exactly. More like recognition. She finished reading the letter slowly, taking her time with the last few lines. When she reached the end, she didn't rush to fold it back up. She let it rest in her hands. Outside, a bird called out, then went quiet again. Margaret looked up toward the ceiling and exhaled. Margaret sat quietly with the letter in her hands. Not reading anymore. Just letting the words settle where they landed. Some letters don't need a second reading. They just need time to breathe. She folded the paper carefully and placed it back on the table, right on top of the stack, like it belonged there now. For a moment, she wondered why she hadn't opened these sooner. Why she'd let them sit for so long. But she didn't judge herself for it. Life had a way of moving fast, even when you didn't mean for it to. There were always reasons to wait. Responsibilities. People counting on you. Days that needed getting through. She'd told herself she'd deal with the letters later. After things settled down. After life got quieter. Funny thing was, life never really did. It just changed its noise. Margaret leaned back in her chair and looked around the kitchen again. The same walls. The same light. The same steady ticking of the clock. Somehow, the room felt different now. Not new. Just lighter. She thought about the rest of the letters waiting their turn. Each one holding a piece of who she used to be. "Well," she said softly, "guess we've got some catching up to do." Outside, the day kept moving. Unbothered. Unimpressed. Inside, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in a while. Not excitement. Not fear. Readiness. She gathered the letters together and tied the twine again. Not too tight. Just enough. There would be time for the others. No need to rush. She carried the bundle back to the drawer and placed it inside, leaving it slightly open this time. A small decision, but an important one. Margaret closed the drawer gently and rested her hand on it for a moment. "Not today," she said. "But soon." The house stayed quiet, steady and patient, like it always had been. Margaret turned back toward the window and let the morning continue. Margaret didn't rush out of the kitchen. She stayed where she was for a moment longer, letting the quiet do its thing. Some mornings needed easing into, like old joints or old memories. She finally stood and walked into the living room, her steps slow, unhurried. The floorboards creaked under her feet, soft and familiar, like they were saying hello. She smiled at that. Still got something to say, huh, she murmured. The living room hadn't changed much over the years. Same couch with the worn arms. Same lamp by the window. Same bookshelf holding more memories than books. Margaret paused near the fireplace and looked at the photographs lined up along the shelf. Faces stared back at her. Some smiling wide. Some serious as Sunday morning. A few of them made her tilt her head, trying to place the year, the moment, the version of herself standing just out of frame. Time had a funny way of doing that. She reached out and straightened one of the frames. An old habit she never quite shook. Her parents smiled back at her from the picture, young and certain, like they thought they had all the time in the world. "Well," she said quietly, "you sure fooled us." The house stayed still, but it felt full somehow. Not crowded, just occupied. Margaret took a slow breath and listened. Not with her ears, but with something deeper. She could almost hear old conversations. Laughter drifting down the hallway. The radio playing low in the evenings. None of it loud. None of it rushing. This house had been built for that kind of life. A life where silence wasn't awkward. It was comfortable. Margaret rested her hand on the back of the couch and nodded to herself, like she'd just remembered something important. Margaret moved farther into the living room, running her fingers lightly along the back of the couch. The fabric worn smooth from years of use. This couch had seen its share of long evenings, quiet conversations, and more than a few naps that were supposed to be short. She walked toward the window and looked out onto the street. The same street she'd watched for most of her life. Different cars now. Different people. But the rhythm stayed about the same. Kids once rode their bikes up and down this block, calling out to each other until the sun dipped low. Now it was quieter. Not empty. Just changed. Margaret understood that kind of change. She turned back toward the room and noticed the old armchair near the lamp. That chair had been claimed long ago. Her husband used to sit there every evening. Newspaper folded just so. Glasses resting low on his nose. He hadn't said much during those hours, but he'd been there. And that had mattered. Margaret rested her hand on the top of the chair and closed her eyes. For a moment, she could almost feel the warmth still there. "Hope you don't mind," she whispered. "Me keeping your spot." The house didn't answer, but it held the moment steady. The clock chimed softly from the other room, marking the hour without making a fuss. Margaret opened her eyes and took a breath. Slow and even. Some places never really forget the people who loved them. They just learn how to wait. Margaret straightened up and glanced toward the hallway, where the rest of the house quietly waited its turn. Margaret stepped into the hallway slowly, like she was crossing into another time. One careful step at a time. The hallway was narrow. Always had been. Walls close enough to make voices travel. She remembered hearing laughter echo here. Arguments too. Though even those had been quiet by today's standards. People used to lower their voices without being asked. At the end of the hallway sat the small guest room. The door half open. Just the way she'd left it. Margaret pushed it open the rest of the way and stood in the doorway. Not going in yet. The bed was neatly made. Corners tucked tight. Quilt smoothed flat. No one had slept there in years. But the room didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused. Sunlight slipped through the thin curtains, laying soft shapes across the floor. Margaret listened. Really listened. No sound. And yet, she could almost hear holiday visits. Suitcases being set down. Voices asking if there was coffee on. She smiled at that. Always coffee, she said softly. She stepped inside and ran her hand across the edge of the bed. The fabric cool beneath her fingers. Some rooms didn't need constant use to stay alive. They just needed to be remembered. Margaret glanced at the small dresser by the wall. Its top clear except for a single lamp. Once, it had been crowded with personal things. Brushes. Books. Small reminders that someone belonged there. Time had taken those away. But not the feeling. She took a breath and let it out slowly. Feeling steady. The house wasn't empty. It was full of quiet company. Margaret turned back toward the hallway. Ready to keep moving. Ready to listen some more. Margaret closed the guest room door gently. Not all the way. Just enough to let it rest where it wanted to. She stood in the hallway for a moment. Hands at her sides. Listening to the house breathe. Old houses did that. They settled. They sighed. They made small sounds that meant nothing and everything at the same time. She moved toward the bathroom next. The door creaking softly as she pushed it open. The mirror above the sink caught her reflection. Hair a little thinner now. Lines where time had decided to stay. Margaret looked at herself without judgment. Well, she said quietly. We've come a long way. She turned the faucet just enough to let the water run. Then shut it off again. Same old pipes. Still doing their job. Some things kept going no matter what. She stepped back into the hallway and made her way toward the bedroom. The room she knew best of all. The door opened easily. Like it had been waiting. The bed sat neatly made. Pillows stacked just the way she liked them. Morning light filled the space. Soft and forgiving. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and rested her hands in her lap. This room had held her best rest and her worst nights. It had heard whispered prayers. Deep sighs. And the kind of silence that comes just before sleep. She glanced at the nightstand. The small lamp. The empty space where another pair of glasses used to sit. Margaret nodded slowly, acknowledging the absence without letting it hurt too much. The house knew. It always did. She stood up again and took a steady breath. There was more to remember. More voices to listen for. And she wasn't done yet. Margaret left the bedroom and walked back toward the living room. Moving a little slower now. Not from tiredness, but from thought. The house felt different after walking through it like that. Like it had been heard. Noticed. She stopped near the center of the living room and turned in a slow circle. Taking it all in one more time. This place had watched her grow older. Had seen her at her best and her worst. And never once asked her to explain herself. That counted for something. Margaret lowered herself onto the couch and rested her hands on her knees. Feeling the familiar dip in the cushions. She'd spent a lot of hours right here. Watching the light change through the window. Listening to the world settle down for the night. Back then, evenings came with conversation. With shared silence. With the comfort of knowing someone else was nearby. Now, the quiet was hers alone. But it wasn't empty. It was full of memory. Full of echoes that didn't demand attention. The clock ticked steadily from the wall. Doing what it always did. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment and let herself rest there. Not sleeping. Just being. She realized then that this house wasn't holding on to the past out of stubbornness. It was holding on to it out of care. Like it knew those voices still mattered. Margaret opened her eyes and smiled softly. "Well," she said under her breath. "Guess you've still got plenty to say." She leaned forward and pushed herself up from the couch. Feeling steady. Ready. The letters were waiting back in the kitchen. And now, she understood why. Some voices needed a house to hold them first. Margaret stood in the kitchen doorway for a long second. Just looking at the table. The letters were still there. Stacked neatly. Like they hadn't moved an inch since yesterday. She walked over slowly and pulled out the chair. The legs scraping softly against the floor. That sound alone brought back 100 mornings. Coffee brewing. Radio murmuring in the background. She sat down and rested her hands beside the stack. "These again," she murmured. Half smiling. The envelopes were worn. Edges softened by time. Addresses written in familiar handwriting. Some she recognized right away. Others took a second. Maybe two. Friends who'd moved away. Family she'd lost touch with. People who'd once been a big deal in her everyday life. Margaret picked up the top letter but didn't open it. She tapped it lightly against the table instead. Funny thing about letters. They didn't rush you. No blinking notifications. No pressure to reply right now. They just waited. She remembered a time when getting mail felt like something special. When you'd actually sit down for it. Not skim. Not multitask. Just sit. Margaret slid the letter back into the stack and leaned back in her chair. Maybe that was the problem all along. Life got too loud. Too fast. And these voices got left behind. Margaret finally chose one envelope from the middle of the stack. Cream-colored. A little thicker than the rest. She turned it over in her hands. Thumb tracing the flap. The name on the front made her pause. "Well, I'll be," she said quietly. She hadn't thought about him in years. Not like this. Not on purpose, anyway. Margaret opened the envelope carefully. As if it might tear just from being remembered. The paper inside crackled softly. That dry, honest sound old letters make. She unfolded it slowly and began to read. The words were simple. Nothing fancy. Talk about the weather. About work. About how strange it felt watching time move on. She smiled at one line in particular. Shaking her head. "You always did ramble," she whispered. As she read, she could hear his voice clearly. Plain as day. Not younger. Not older. Just him. Margaret let the letter rest on the table and stared out the window. Funny how someone could be gone from your life, but still show up like that. Years later. Out of nowhere. She took a slow breath and folded the letter back up. Some voices didn't disappear. They just waited for the right moment to be heard. Margaret sat quietly for a moment after folding the letter. Her fingers resting on the table. Not moving. The kitchen felt warmer somehow. Like the house approved of what she was doing. She reached for the next envelope. Then stopped. No rush, she told herself. And meant it. That was something she'd learned late in life. But better late than never. She chose another letter. This one thinner. Edges a little rough. The handwriting belonged to a woman she'd worked with years ago. Someone who'd known her during a season when life felt busy and uncertain. Margaret smiled softly as she read. The letter talked about everyday stuff. Commutes. Office gossip. Plans that never quite worked out. Nothing dramatic. And yet, it pulled her right back. She remembered laughing over bad coffee. Rolling her eyes at long meetings. Dreaming out loud about someday. Funny how those ordinary moments ended up mattering so much. She paused mid-sentence and looked up at the clock. Time had passed. But it didn't feel wasted. Margaret finished the letter and set it aside carefully. These weren't just words on paper. They were proof that she'd been there. That she'd lived. That she'd mattered. Margaret opened another envelope. Then another. Soon, the table held small piles of opened letters. Each one carrying its own quiet weight. Some made her smile. Some made her sigh. A few made her shake her head and mutter. Well, that didn't age well. She chuckled softly at that. Surprised by how easy laughter still came. One letter ended with a promise. The kind people make when they mean it at the time. We'll get together soon, it said. Margaret leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. Life had other plans. As it often did. Still, she didn't feel bitter. Those promises weren't lies. They were hope. Written honestly in the moment. She gathered the letters into a single stack again and squared them carefully. These voices hadn't failed her. They'd simply lived their own lives. Just like she had. Margaret placed her hand gently over the stack and nodded to herself. "All right," she said softly. "I hear you." And for the first time since returning to the house, she felt something shift. Not closure, but understanding. Margaret gathered the letters and carried them carefully to the living room, holding them like something fragile, even though they were already worn. She set them down on the coffee table and stood there for a moment, unsure what came next. That was all right. Not every moment needed a plan. She walked to the window and looked outside, watching a couple of leaves tumble across the sidewalk. Fall had a way of slowing everything down. Like it was giving the world permission to rest. Margaret rested her forehead lightly against the glass. There had been years when she didn't allow herself to pause. When stopping felt like falling behind. Now, she understood something different. Stopping was how you caught up with yourself. She turned back to the letters and sat down on the couch. One by one, she straightened the envelopes again. Not to organize them. Just to touch them. Each letter represented a moment someone had thought of her. That counted. More than she'd ever realized at the time. The room grew quieter as afternoon shifted toward evening. Shadows stretched across the floor, moving slow and steady. Margaret switched on the lamp beside the couch, its warm glow filling the space. She picked up one last letter and held it without opening it. Some things didn't need to be revisited right away. Just knowing they were there was enough. Margaret leaned back and let out a long breath. The kind that comes from deep inside. When you finally stop carrying so much. She thought about all the people who had passed through her life. Some briefly. Some for years. None of them had been meaningless. Even the ones who drifted away had left something behind. A lesson. A memory. A version of herself. Margaret closed her eyes and let the quiet settle around her. The house didn't interrupt. It understood. Tomorrow, she'd decide what to do with the letters. Tonight. It was enough to sit. To remember. To feel. And in that stillness, Margaret felt lighter than she had in a long time. Morning came in slowly. The way it used to. Soft light slipped through the curtains. Not demanding anything. Margaret woke without an alarm. Just the quiet sense that it was time. She sat up in bed and rested her feet on the floor, letting herself adjust. No rushing today. No schedule pulling her forward. She made her way to the kitchen and put the kettle on. The familiar click sounding louder in the still house. While the water heated, her eyes drifted back to the living room. The letters were still there. Exactly where she'd left them. Margaret poured her coffee and carried the mug with both hands, feeling the warmth. She stopped in front of the stack and smiled faintly. "Good morning," she said to no one in particular. She picked up the top few envelopes, then set them down again. Her fingers hesitated over one at the bottom. It was different, slightly heavier, addressed in careful, unfamiliar handwriting. Margaret frowned gently. She didn't remember this one. That alone made her pause. Margaret sat down slowly, coffee resting untouched beside her. She turned the envelope over, studying it like it might explain itself. No return address. No date she could see. Just her name, written clearly, like the writer wanted to be sure she noticed. "Well," she murmured. "That's new." She slid a finger under the flap and stopped again. Funny how a simple piece of paper could make your heart beat a little faster. Margaret took a steady breath and opened it. Inside was a single sheet, folded carefully, as if the words mattered. She unfolded it and read the first line. Then read it again. Her shoulders relaxed, then stiffened. This wasn't a casual letter. This was the kind someone wrote after thinking a long time. The words weren't dramatic, but they were honest. They spoke of regret, of things left unsaid, of moments missed. Margaret lowered the letter slightly and stared ahead. Some voices didn't fade with time. They waited. And this one had been waiting a very long while. Margaret brought the letter closer, as if distance might soften the words. The handwriting was steady, careful, like someone who didn't want to mess this up. The letter spoke about time passing, about days turning into years faster than expected. It talked about choices, about silence that stretched too long, about waiting for the right moment that never showed up. Margaret nodded slowly as she read. She knew that feeling. Everyone did. Eventually, one line made her stop. "I often wondered if you knew how much you mattered." She read it again, then once more. The room felt very still. Margaret rested the letter in her lap and stared at the floor. So many people walked through life assuming others understood, assuming feelings were obvious. They weren't. They never had been. She thought of all the times she'd almost said something, then decided against it. Not out of fear, but habit. Margaret picked the letter back up and continued reading. Her breathing slow, steady. Some words didn't accuse. They simply told the truth. The letter ended without asking for anything. No apology demanded. No response required. Just a quiet admission, placed gently into her hands. Margaret folded the paper carefully and held it there for a moment. She didn't feel angry. She didn't feel sad. Not exactly. What she felt was understanding. The kind that arrives late, but still matters. She leaned back on the couch and closed her eyes. Outside, a car passed by. Somewhere down the street. Life kept moving. Just like it always had. Margaret smiled faintly. So many people carried words they never released, thinking there'd be time later. Sometimes there was. Sometimes there wasn't. She opened her eyes and looked at the letter again. This one had made it. That counted. Margaret placed it back on the table, separate from the others. This letter wasn't meant to be mixed in. It had earned its own space. She took a deep breath and sat quietly, letting the moment settle. Not everything needed fixing. Some things just needed to be seen. Margaret remained on the couch long after she placed the letter down, hands resting loosely in her lap, breathing slow and even. She wasn't thinking hard, not trying to analyze anything. She was letting the feeling arrive on its own. That was something age had taught her. That clarity showed up better when invited, not forced. She glanced around the living room, at the familiar furniture, the quiet corners. This house had seen so many versions of her. The younger woman who believed time was endless. The busy one who always had somewhere to be. The tired one who thought rest could wait. Margaret smiled gently at that. Rest always waited, patient as ever. She reached for the letter again and turned it over once more. The paper felt real, solid. Whoever had written it hadn't rushed. They'd chosen their words carefully, maybe rewriting them more than once. Margaret respected that. It took courage to say things late, when pretending no longer worked. She nodded slowly to herself. Some truths didn't arrive on schedule. They arrived when both people were finally ready. As afternoon drifted toward evening, the light in the room shifted, growing softer. Margaret stood and carried the letter to the small desk by the window. She opened the drawer and placed it inside, separate from everything else. Not hidden, just safe. She closed the drawer gently and rested her hand on it for a moment. Tomorrow didn't need an answer. Neither did next week. This letter wasn't asking for action. It was offering peace. Margaret walked back to the couch and sat down again, feeling steadier than before. She realized something then, clear and calm. Life wasn't about tying up every loose end. Some ends stayed loose on purpose. They reminded you that you'd lived, that you'd felt deeply, that you'd mattered to someone. Margaret leaned back and closed her eyes. The house settled around her, quiet and understanding. Whatever came next, she would meet it without hurry. For now, this moment was enough. The next morning arrived quietly. No announcements, no demands. Margaret woke feeling rested in a way she hadn't in years. Like something heavy had been set down during the night. She moved through her routine slowly, making the bed, opening the curtains, letting fresh air drift in. Outside, the neighborhood was already awake. A dog barked somewhere down the block. A car door closed. Someone laughed. Life. going about its business. Margaret stood at the window with her coffee and watched it unfold. For a long time, she'd kept herself slightly apart. Not out of bitterness, but habit. It was easier to stay in, to keep the world at a comfortable distance. But standing there now, she felt something else. Curiosity. She noticed the way the sunlight hit the sidewalk, the way leaves gathered along the curb. Small things, still inviting. Margaret took a slow sip of coffee and nodded to herself. Maybe it was time to step back into it. Just a little. No big gestures. No announcements. Just opening the door again. Margaret decided to take a walk. Nothing ambitious. Just down the block and back. She slipped on her shoes and grabbed her light jacket. Pausing at the front door. The handle felt cool in her hand. She hesitated. Then smiled at herself. "Look at you," she said softly. Overthinking again. The door opened with a familiar creak, and the morning air greeted her kindly. She stepped onto the porch and stood there for a moment, letting the sounds settle around her. A neighbor waved from across the street. Easy and casual. "Morning," they called. "Morning," Margaret replied. Her voice steady. It felt good to be seen, to be part of the simple flow of things. She walked slowly, not counting steps, not measuring time, just moving. With each step, the world felt a little closer, a little less distant. Margaret realized she wasn't returning to life. She'd never really left it. She'd just been waiting for the right moment to rejoin. And now, that moment was here. Margaret continued down the sidewalk, hands tucked loosely into her jacket pockets. Pace unhurried. The neighborhood felt familiar, yet slightly new. Like seeing an old photo with fresh eyes. She passed houses she'd known for years. Some with new paint. Some exactly the same. Time left its marks differently on everything. A couple was tending their garden. Moving slowly. Working together without much talk. Margaret watched them for a moment. Smiling. There was comfort in that kind of quiet partnership. She remembered mornings just like that. When conversation wasn't necessary. When presence was enough. As she walked, she noticed how good it felt to be outside. To feel the ground beneath her feet. For a while, she'd convinced herself she didn't need much. But maybe needing less didn't mean wanting nothing. Margaret stopped near the corner and rested for a moment. Looking down the street. She could turn back now. Or she could go a little farther. Neither choice felt heavy. She chose to keep walking. Sometimes, moving forward didn't require a reason. It just required willingness. By the time Margaret turned back toward home, the sun was higher, warming her shoulders. Her steps felt steady, confident. She realized she was humming softly. An old tune she hadn't thought about in years. The sound surprised her. It slipped out naturally, without effort. Back at her house, she paused at the gate and looked up at the front porch. It didn't feel like a place she was retreating to anymore. It felt like a place she was returning from. Margaret opened the gate and stepped inside, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. Not because she'd gone far, but because she'd gone at all. She settled back into her chair inside and set her jacket aside. The house welcomed her the way it always had. Still, something was different. She was different. Margaret glanced toward the desk by the window, where the letter waited quietly. It hadn't demanded anything from her. It had simply opened a door. And now, she was walking through life with that door wide open. Margaret spent the rest of the afternoon moving gently through the house, straightening small things, opening windows, letting light travel where it hadn't in a while. She didn't call it cleaning. It felt more like welcoming. Each room responded in its own quiet way. The kitchen felt brighter, the living room warmer, the hallway less heavy. Margaret paused near the desk again and pulled the drawer open, just enough to see the letter resting there. Still calm, still patient. She didn't take it out. Some things worked best when left undisturbed. She made herself a simple meal and sat at the table, eating slowly, listening to the radio play an old song she recognized. It reminded her of long drives, windows down, no particular destination. Back then, she'd believed life would always feel wide open. Somewhere along the way, she'd forgotten that it still was. Margaret smiled softly and finished her meal. There was nothing urgent waiting for her. And for once, that felt like a gift. As evening settled in, Margaret stepped back onto the porch. A light sweater draped over her shoulders. The sky shifted through soft shades of blue and gold. Slow and unhurried, she sat in her chair and watched the day end, listening to distant sounds. A TV somewhere, footsteps passing by. Life, unremarkable and beautiful. Margaret rested her hands in her lap and took a deep breath. She thought about how close she'd come to staying closed off, to letting time pass without truly stepping into it. One letter had changed that. Not by demanding anything, but by reminding her she still mattered. She smiled. A real one this time. Whatever tomorrow held, she would meet it open-hearted. No rush. No fear. Just presence. The porch light flicked on automatically as darkness settled. Margaret leaned back and watched it glow. The door behind her remained open. Just a little. And for the first time in a long while, she was exactly where she needed to be. The days that followed settled into an easy rhythm. Nothing dramatic. Nothing rushed. Margaret woke when her body told her to. Not when a clock demanded it. She spent mornings near the window, coffee cooling beside her, watching light move across the room. Some afternoons she walked. Other days she stayed in, both choices feeling equally right. That was new. For years, she'd believed good days needed proof. Something accomplished. Something checked off. Now, a good day could simply be a quiet one. Margaret noticed she smiled more often. At little things. At nothing at all. She spoke to neighbors again. Short conversations. Easy laughter. No pressure to explain where she'd been. Or why she'd pulled back. Everyone carried their own stories. She kept the letter in the drawer. Not forgotten. Just understood. It didn't ask to be reread. Its work was already done. One afternoon, Margaret found herself at the desk by the window. Pen in hand. She hadn't planned to write anything. It just felt like the right moment. She stared at the blank page. Then smiled softly. "So," she said aloud. "Let's try this." The words came slowly at first. Then steadier. She wrote about the house. The mornings. The way time felt different now. She didn't worry about who might read it. Some things were meant simply to be written. When she finished, she folded the paper and set it aside. Not to mail. Not yet. Maybe never. Margaret leaned back and looked around the room. The house felt full. Not of noise. But of life. She realized something important then. Nothing had been missing all along. She had simply needed to come back to herself. And now, she was home. As weeks turned into months, Margaret noticed how little she needed to feel content. Mornings came with familiar sounds. Birds at the feeder. The distant hum of traffic waking up. She kept her routines loose, allowing space for change. Some days she wrote a page or two. Other days she simply sat and listened to the world move outside. Both felt complete. She began leaving her door open more often. Not wide. Just enough. Neighbors stopped by occasionally, bringing news. Sometimes cookies. Margaret welcomed them without feeling drained. Connection didn't have to be constant to be real. She learned to appreciate pauses. The kind that didn't need filling. Silence had its own language. And she was finally fluent. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Margaret stood in the doorway and looked out at the street. Lights flickered on in nearby houses. One by one. Life unfolding. Quiet and steady. She thought about the past. Not with regret, but with respect. Every season had given her something. Even the lonely ones. Margaret rested her hand on the doorframe and smiled. She didn't need to chase anything anymore. She didn't need to prove she'd lived well. The simple fact that she was still open. Still curious. Still kind. That was enough. She turned back into the house and closed the door gently behind her. Inside, the lamp glowed warmly. The chair waited. The desk stood ready. Margaret settled into her evening with ease. Nothing left undone. Nothing left unsaid. just a life. Lived fully. At its own pace.